Tomorrow marks 1 year since the death of George Floyd. Floyd died after former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for more than 9 minutes during an arrest. Hundreds filled the streets of Minneapolis yesterday to renew their commitment to racial equality and calls for police reform. President Biden, who is set to meet with members of the Floyd family tomorrow, has urged Congress to approve the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act before the 1-year mark passes. But lawmakers, who remain at odds over key provisions of the bill, are set to miss the deadline. So joining me now is Rashawn Ray. He is a Rubenstein Fellow of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. To sort of pull apart this George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, it's massive, and it aims to offer a complete overhaul of policing in this country. But there are some issues that remain severe sticking points. I remember hearing you say that part of the problem with the way the system works right now is that fear should not be used as a defense when police officers kill, hurt, behave badly. One of the sticking points for lawmakers is this issue of qualified immunity for police officers. Why is qualified immunity such a hot button issue? And what are your thoughts on it? What needs to be changed?
Well, thank you for having me on. I mean, qualified immunity is a court doctrine that essentially prevents police officers and other government officials from facing any sort of financial culpability. Now, the issue with law enforcement is that when those police misconduct settlements are paid out, like the $27 million to George Floyd's family, the $12 million to Breonna Taylor's family, the $20 million to William Green's family, that money solely primarily falls on taxpayers. And what people are saying is that we need to shift some of the blame. Now, when it comes to the other parts of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, pretty much Republicans and Democrats overwhelmingly agree. These are low-hanging fruit, things like banning no-knock warrants, providing implicit bias training, banning chokeholds. But qualified immunity is the big sticking point because Republicans think that people would just overwhelmingly sue police officers, while Democrats are saying they're absolved from any sort of accountability. I think that police department insurance policies and police officer liability insurance is a way moving forward here.
So I've heard you talk about this before, because this is sort of a component that's not included in the bill, and it's not included in a lot of conversations when we talk about reimagining what the police do in this country. Can you just explain the shift that you're talking about and why you think it would make such a huge difference?
So I've examined for policing for over a decade. At the University of Maryland, we have a virtual reality training program for law enforcement. And what we started realizing is that some of the solutions that were put in place were not actually going to solve the problem. But when we start looking at other aspects of our ecosystem, healthcare, auto insurance, we oftentimes see that insurance is put in place to protect people from liability and to provide a payout when something has went wrong. We also know that small departments are part of a risk pool oftentimes because they don't have the money like the large municipalities like New York City or even Chicago or Washington, D.C. to pay these things out. So what would happen is that a police department would have an insurance policy. When there is a misconduct settlement, instead of taxpayers paying it, it would be paid out of that insurance policy. That will do a couple of things. First, it will provide oversight and accountability for the department. It will provide another way to do a checks and balance. It will also help chiefs be able to get out those bad apples. And then if we couple that with officer liability insurance in the way that Denver and Colorado have been doing, what will happen then is that officers like Derek Chauvin, when he knelt on that teenager's neck, he wouldn't even have been able to be insurable to even be on the back of George Floyd's neck. And I think these are the changes that Democrats and Republicans want, because over 60% of Americans want to see qualified immunity rolled back, including about a quarter of Republicans.
What do you say to people who say a shift like that would have sort of a chilling effect on police officers because they'd be concerned about their insurance rate?
You know, we always hear that. Look, it's similar to driving a vehicle. If you do what you're supposed to do, you don't have to worry about your insurance going up. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, like unfortunately some of the police officers we're talking about are doing, then you're going to have an issue with it. But for a majority of police officers, they don't want to work with those bad apples either, because my research shows that good apples cannot simply combat these bad apples that rot in the tree. Instead, good apples become spoiled and stained themselves because of their contact with them. So when it comes to this moving forward, this is just simply what has to happen. Our taxpayer dollars pay law enforcement to protect and serve. And in a lot of communities, particularly communities of color, we are not seeing that happen. In a recent report in Washington, D.C., it found that over 80% of the people who were stopped where force was used and no citation were given were Black people. This shows that when we look at the police killing rate, which mind you has not went down over the past year, instead it stayed the same, and in some places it actually went up, does not correspond to violent crime. If it did, we'd be having a different story. But instead, what the research shows is that the police killing rates and the violent crime rates are completely out of whack with one another, suggesting that we can't simply go about reform as usual. We have to reimagine and rebuild law enforcement in the United States.
Listen, I want to ask you really quickly, because we're out of time, but I want to get like your overall for the Justice in Policing Act, the key components that you think will be the most transformative, and the other things that look good on paper but you don't believe are going to make a significant change. Give me sort of your 3 top, 3 bottom, if you could.
Yeah, well, look, the things that aren't going to matter a whole lot are implicit bias trainings, the chokehold bans, and body-worn cameras. Not because they don't matter, but because those things are already in motion. There's pretty much bipartisan support across the board on those. The 3 things that will make the biggest difference is absolving qualified immunity, creating national databases for use of force, and bad officers. If those things are not in the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, we will be having the same conversation 5 or 10 years from now, just like we've been having over the past several years.
Rashawn Ray, I wish I could hang on to you for like another half hour. I find the research that you're doing with the VR stuff really fascinating. So hopefully we can have you back on again to gain some more insight into, what the real problems are when it comes to policing here in this country. Rashawn Ray, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.